Chapter 1. You like the 5-minute chart because it makes you feel involved. That's the part you don't usually say out loud. It feels active. It feels sharp. It feels like you're finally doing something instead of waiting around while higher time frames crawl. And if you're honest, a part of you chose it because you were tired of feeling late, tired of feeling passive, tired of watching moves happen without you. The problem is that same reason is exactly why most people never master it. You don't fail on the 5-minute because it's fast. You fail because it doesn't give you room to lie to yourself. Every hesitation shows, every impulse shows, every emotional leak shows up immediately. There's no hiding behind long candles or wide stops or vague narratives about letting it breathe. On the 5-minute, your behavior is exposed in real time, and most traders aren't prepared for that level of honesty. The uncomfortable truth is that most people come to the 5-minute chart already overstimulated. They sit down carrying urgency from their life, pressure from their account size, expectations from previous losses, and they think speed will solve that tension. They think faster entries mean faster progress. But speed doesn't calm urgency, it amplifies it. And the 5-minute chart doesn't reward urgency. It punishes it quietly and repeatedly. You've probably had sessions where you took more trades than you planned, not because setups were objectively better, but because being flat felt wrong. You watched price move and felt excluded. You felt like if you didn't participate, you were wasting the time frame. That feeling doesn't come from opportunity. It comes from attachment. And until that attachment is addressed, no amount of technical refinement will make the 5-minute chart behave for you. Here's the part most people don't want to hear. The 5-minute time frame is not for active traders. It's for controlled traders. It's not about reacting quickly. It's about deciding less often. When you treat it like a rapid-fire environment, you turn it into noise. When you treat it like a precision environment, it becomes clean. The chart itself doesn't change. Only your relationship to it does. You can see this difference clearly if you think back to the trades that actually worked for you on the 5-minute. Not the exciting ones, the quiet ones. The trades where you weren't emotionally invested, where you entered without hesitation and managed without interference. Those trades didn't feel fast. They felt obvious. And obvious trades don't come from speed. They come from alignment. Most traders try to master the 5-minute by adding more filters, more confirmations, more rules. That's not where the issue is. The issue is that they're trying to use complexity to compensate for instability. They don't trust themselves to sit still, so they give themselves more to do. They don't trust silence, so they fill it with activity. The 5-minute chart does not reward busyness. It rewards restraint disguised as simplicity. When you first open a 5-minute chart, it feels alive. Candles forming constantly. Momentum shifting quickly. Opportunities everywhere. That sensation is intoxicating. It makes you feel closer to the market. But closeness is not the same as clarity. Being close without being grounded just means you're more exposed to noise. And noise is where discipline quietly dissolves. You might recognize the pattern. You tell yourself you're only going to take the clean setups. The first one works or almost works. Confidence rises. You start seeing similar patterns everywhere. The standards loosen just a little. You justify an entry because it's close enough. You take a loss. You tell yourself the next one will be cleaner. Suddenly, you're trading reactions instead of structure. And the 5-minute chart becomes chaos again, even though nothing about it actually changed. Mastery of the 5-minute doesn't start with execution. It starts with containment. Containing how often you engage. Containing how much you care about each candle. Containing the urge to interpret every movement as meaningful. Until you can contain those impulses, the time frame will always feel overwhelming, no matter how experienced you are. There's a reason the 5-minute chart attracts traders who feel behind. It promises compression, faster feedback, quicker validation. But compression comes at a cost. Everything is magnified. Mistakes compound faster. Emotional reactions stack more quickly. There's less time to reset between decisions. That doesn't make it inferior. It makes it demanding. And demand without structure turns into stress. You don't master the 5-minute by being alert. You master it by being selective. By allowing 90% of what you see to mean nothing to you. By letting price move without feeling summoned. That's difficult because the chart is constantly asking for your attention. Candles forming feels like invitation. But mastery is learning when not to respond to the invitation. If you've ever ended a 5-minute session feeling mentally fried, it wasn't because you were analyzing too much. It was because you were reacting too much. Reaction drains energy faster than analysis ever will. And the 5-minute chart exposes that difference mercilessly. You don't leave exhausted because it's fast. You leave exhausted because you were emotionally engaged the entire time. This is why traders who genuinely master the 5-minute look boring from the outside. They don't click constantly. They don't narrate every move. They don't feel compelled to comment on every candle. They're waiting for something specific, and until it appears, they're detached. That detachment isn't passive. It's deliberate. It's the foundation everything else sits on. If you're listening to this and feeling slightly called out, that's intentional. The 5-minute chart doesn't require talent. It requires honesty. Honesty about why you chose it. Honesty about how you behave when nothing is happening. Honesty about whether you're trading structure or trading stimulation. Most people avoid that honesty because it threatens their self-image as disciplined traders. But avoiding it is exactly why the time frame never stabilizes for them. There's also a subtle ego component here. Trading faster feels more advanced, more professional, more impressive. Waiting on higher time frames feels slow, almost amateur. The 5-minute gives you the illusion of being closer to the action, more skilled, more in control. But real control is invisible. It shows up as fewer decisions, not more. And that's hard to accept when you equate mastery with activity. The 5-minute time frame will force you to confront how you handle boredom. Because despite how fast it looks, most of the time, nothing is happening that deserves your involvement. And if boredom makes you anxious, you'll manufacture trades. You'll convince yourself something is there because being flat feels uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a market problem. It's a psychological one. And until it's resolved, the time frame will continue to feel hostile. If you've ever thought the 5-minute chart was too choppy or unpredictable, that might be your signal. Not that the chart is flawed, but that your expectations are misaligned. The 5-minute is not designed to provide constant clarity. It's designed to provide brief moments of precision surrounded by noise. Mastery is learning to wait for those moments without trying to tame the noise in between. This is the part where people usually want rules. Entry criteria, confirmation logic, execution tricks. That comes later. None of it matters if you don't first understand what the 5-minute demands from you psychologically. You cannot brute force mastery here. The time frame will always outpace brute force. It requires calibration, not aggression. If you're serious about mastering the 5-minute, you need to be willing to feel underutilized at first. To sit there and do nothing while price moves. To watch candles form without reacting. To let opportunities pass without chasing them. That restraint will feel wrong initially, like you're not doing enough. That feeling is exactly what you're training out of yourself. Take a second and like the video if this feels uncomfortably accurate. Because most traders never stop long enough to recognize why the 5-minute keeps slipping through their hands. Recognition is the first step toward control on this time frame. The 5-minute chart is not chaotic. You are chaotic on it. That's not an insult. It's a starting point. And once you accept that, mastery becomes possible instead of theoretical. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what actually stabilizes a trader on the 5-minute. Not tactics, not setups, but the internal shift that turns this time frame from exhausting to precise. Because once that shift happens, everything else becomes much simpler to apply. Chapter 2. At some point, if you stay on the 5-minute chart long enough, you notice a strange contradiction. The more you try to control it, the more it slips. The harder you focus, the noisier it feels. The more intent you bring to each candle, the less clarity you seem to have. That contradiction is not accidental. It's the first signal that the 5-minute time frame doesn't reward effort the way you're used to, effort being rewarded. It rewards containment. And containment feels backward to traders who equate mastery with engagement. Most traders try to stabilize themselves on the 5-minute by tightening everything. Tighter stops, tighter rules, tighter criteria, tighter attention. And for a brief moment, that feels like progress. You feel disciplined. You feel locked in. You feel professional. But underneath that tightness is tension, and tension leaks. It leaks into execution, into patience, into how you respond when price doesn't immediately validate your decision. The 5-minute chart magnifies that leak faster than any other time frame. Stability on this time frame does not come from control. It comes from pacing. Not pacing the market, but pacing yourself. Learning how to sit in front of a constantly moving chart, without feeling obligated to participate in that movement. That sounds simple until you try it, because movement feels like demand. Candles forming feel like opportunity, and opportunity feels like responsibility. The 5-minute chart will test whether you can separate those sensations or whether you collapse them into one urgent impulse to act. You've probably experienced this. You tell yourself you'll wait for alignment, but price starts moving in one direction. The move looks clean. You weren't ready for it, but it looks like it's going to go. You hesitate. You feel the pull. You justify a late entry because you don't want to miss it. That decision didn't come from analysis. It came from tempo mismatch. The market moved faster than your internal pacing, and instead of letting it go, you chased it to restore equilibrium. That's not strategy failure. That's pacing failure. The traders who stabilize on the 5-minute do something unintuitive. They slow themselves down while the market stays fast. They don't try to match the chart's speed. They create their own rhythm and only act when the chart briefly syncs with it. That rhythm doesn't change because price is moving. It doesn't accelerate because volatility increases. It stays constant. And that constancy is what allows precision to emerge. This is why most traders feel like the 5-minute is overwhelming. They're letting the chart dictate their internal tempo. Every candle speeds them up. Every pullback slows them down. They're being dragged around psychologically by price action instead of observing it from a stable baseline. That's exhausting, and exhaustion leads to mistakes that feel random but aren't. They're the predictable outcome of letting the environment control your nervous system. There's a moment when a trader finally realizes this, and it's usually after frustration peaks. They notice that the days they traded less felt cleaner, that the sessions where they felt bored produced better outcomes than the ones where they felt engaged, that the trades they waited for were easier to manage than the ones they chased. That realization is uncomfortable because it contradicts the belief that effort equals results. But on the 5-minute, effort often just equals interference. Stability here begins when you stop trying to stay locked in the entire session. You don't need sustained intensity, you need selective presence. Being fully present for the few moments that matter and mentally absent for everything else. That's a difficult balance because it requires you to disengage without checking out, to watch without interpreting, to observe without narrating. Most traders don't realize how much internal commentary they're running until they try to turn it off. Think about how often you're mentally explaining what price is doing while watching the 5-minute. You're labeling moves, predicting outcomes, constructing stories. All of that feels analytical, but most of it is just noise. The chart doesn't need your narration, it needs your patience. The more you talk to yourself internally, the harder it becomes to see what actually matters. Clarity doesn't come from adding interpretation, it comes from removing it. The 5-minute chart stabilizes when you stop asking it to entertain you. That's hard to hear because entertainment is part of why people gravitate toward it. It's visually stimulating, it's always changing, it gives you something to react to. But mastery requires you to strip that away, to let the chart be boring most of the time, to accept that most movement is irrelevant, and irrelevance is something traders are terrible at tolerating. You can feel when this shift starts to happen. You sit down and the urge to trade doesn't hit immediately. You don't feel pressure to make the session count. You're not scanning frantically, you're waiting. And waiting doesn't feel passive anymore, it feels deliberate. You're not hoping something happens. You're allowing yourself to not act until something actually deserves action. That mental stance changes everything about how the 5-minute behaves for you. This is also where people get confused and think they're becoming less aggressive or less driven. They worry they're losing their edge. But what they're really losing is compulsive engagement. And that's not edge, that's addiction to activity. Edge on the 5-minute comes from contrast, from doing less than everyone else and acting only when conditions align tightly enough to justify intervention. That contrast is invisible unless you've experienced both states firsthand. Most traders never give themselves enough time in this stabilized state to see what it produces. They get uncomfortable with how quiet it feels and revert back to overengagement. They mistake calm for complacency. They reintroduce urgency because urgency feels productive. And the cycle starts again. The 5-minute doesn't punish them dramatically. It just becomes noisy again, inconsistent, hard to read. And they blame the time frame instead of their relationship to it. You'll notice something else once stability starts to take hold. Your tolerance for imperfection increases. You stop needing the chart to look perfect before you engage. You stop needing constant confirmation because you're no longer rushing. You can wait for clarity instead of forcing it. And when clarity shows up, it's obvious, not exciting. Obvious. The trade stands out because everything else has faded into the background. This is where people usually ask for structure. They want to know what they should be looking for now that they're calmer. But structure without stability is meaningless. It just becomes another thing to react to. The order matters. You don't build structure to create stability. You create stability so structure can be applied cleanly. Skipping that order is why most 5-minute strategies feel inconsistent, no matter how refined they look on paper. There's also a physical component to this stabilization that people ignore. The 5-minute chart triggers physiological responses: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, microtension. If you're sitting there clenched, leaning forward, eyes glued to every candle, your body is already in reaction mode. You can't think clearly from that state. The traders who master this time frame look relaxed, not because they don't care, but because they've learned how to keep their nervous system neutral while price moves quickly. That neutrality is not something you think your way into. It's something you practice by repeatedly not acting, by letting candles close without response, by watching setups fail without trying to save them, by allowing missed trades to exist without chasing them. Each time you do that, your body learns that inaction is not danger. That lesson is what creates real stability on fast charts, not confidence or experience alone. You might notice resistance coming up as you hear this. Thoughts like, if I'm not reacting, I'll miss opportunities. Or if I slow down, I won't make enough trades. Or this sounds good in theory, but the market doesn't wait. Those thoughts are common. They come from scarcity, the belief that opportunity is fleeting and must be captured immediately. The 5-minute chart thrives on exploiting that belief. Mastery comes when you stop believing it. The irony is that once you stabilize yourself, you actually miss fewer meaningful trades. Not because you're faster, but because you're clearer. You're not distracted by mediocre movement. You're not pulled into marginal setups. Your attention is reserved, and reserved attention is sharper when it's finally deployed. That's the paradox of the 5-minute. Slowing yourself down is what allows you to act decisively when it matters. If this chapter is shifting how you think about why the 5-minute has felt so unstable for you, take a second and like the video. These shifts don't land through motivation. They land through recognition. And recognition requires you to stop and actually notice what's been happening inside you while you trade. Stability on the 5-minute is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you return to. You'll drift. You'll get pulled back into reaction. You'll have sessions where urgency sneaks in. That doesn't mean you failed. It means the time frame is doing what it does best, exposing whether you're grounded or not. Each time you notice and recalibrate, you strengthen the skill that actually matters here. Chapter 3. There's a point where the 5-minute chart starts to look different, even though nothing about it has changed. The candles are still forming at the same pace. The volatility is still there. The structure is still imperfect and sometimes messy. What's different is that you're no longer trying to extract meaning from every movement. You're no longer narrating what price might do next. You're letting most of it pass without interpretation. And in that space, clarity starts to show up naturally instead of being forced. Before this shift, you probably experienced the chart as a stream of possibilities. Every push looked like a potential breakout. Every pullback looked like an entry. Every pause felt like a decision point. That constant evaluation is exhausting. It turns the session into a series of micro decisions, most of which don't matter. Mastery on the 5-minute doesn't come from making better micro decisions. It comes from eliminating the need to make them in the first place. You start to notice that real opportunities don't ask for attention. They don't feel urgent. They don't rely on perfect timing. They arrive fully formed. When your internal pace is steady, those moments stand out without effort. There's no rush to act because there's no doubt about whether action is required. The decision feels obvious not because the setup is perfect, but because everything else has faded into irrelevance. This is where execution stops feeling stressful. You're not weighing outcomes. You're not calculating how much this trade matters. You're not thinking about the last trade or the next one. You're responding to what's in front of you with a calm decisiveness that wasn't possible before. The 5-minute chart hasn't slowed down. You have. And because you've slowed down, you're no longer being dragged by its speed. You might notice that your entries become cleaner without trying to be. You're not forcing precision. You're waiting for alignment. That alignment doesn't need to be perfect, but it needs to be complete. When it's there, you don't hesitate. When it's not, you don't negotiate. That binary response is something most traders never experience because they're constantly living in the gray area between yes and no. The 5 minute chart lives in the gray. Mastery requires you to not live there with it. This is also where the urge to overtrade starts to dissolve. Not because you're restricting yourself, but because there's nothing pulling you into marginal situations anymore. Overtrading is rarely about greed. It's about discomfort with inactivity. Once inactivity stops feeling uncomfortable, overtrading loses its fuel. You don't need rules to stop you. You simply don't want to engage unless there's a reason that feels solid enough to justify it. There's a subtle confidence that emerges here, and it's easy to misunderstand. It's not confidence in winning, it's confidence in waiting. Confidence that missing a move doesn't harm you. Confidence that sitting out doesn't put you behind. Confidence that the next opportunity doesn't depend on the last one. That confidence is what allows execution to stay clean under pressure. Without it, every trade carries the weight of what you think you missed before. You can feel this most clearly when a trade doesn't work. On the 5 minute, losing trades come quickly. Before, that speed probably rattled you. Losses felt abrupt, like proof that you misread something. Now they feel contained. The loss happens, you process it, and you move on without urgency. There's no immediate need to make it back. No impulse to reassert control. That restraint keeps the session intact instead of spiraling into damage control. This is also where the 5 minute stops feeling chaotic. Chaos is usually just information without hierarchy. When everything feels important, nothing is clear. Once you establish internal hierarchy, most of what you see becomes background. The chart doesn't become simpler. Your perception becomes more selective. And selectivity is what turns speed into precision instead of overwhelm. You might be surprised by how little you actually need to do once this shift settles in. Fewer clicks, fewer adjustments, less screen time. The 5 minute chart no longer demands constant supervision. You're not babysitting trades. You're letting them play out according to your plan. That reduction in activity isn't laziness, it's efficiency. And efficiency is what allows consistency to exist on a fast time frame. There's also a moment where you realize that many of the things you thought you needed to master were never the real issue. Indicators, confirmations, advanced patterns. All of that mattered far less than your ability to not react prematurely. The 5 minute chart punishes impatience more than ignorance. Once impatience is removed, even simple structure becomes effective. This is where most people make a mistake. They feel this clarity briefly and assume they've arrived. They loosen up too much. They stop being deliberate. They reintroduce activity because they feel confident. And the chart becomes noisy again. Mastery here is not a destination, it's a posture. Something you maintain, not something you achieve and forget. The moment you start trying to extract more from the time frame, it pushes back. You'll notice that your best 5 minute sessions start to look uneventful from the outside. A small number of trades, long periods of waiting, no emotional swings, no frantic adjustments. That uneventfulness is not accidental. It's the visible result of internal order. And internal order is the real edge on this time frame. If you've ever wondered why some traders seem to glide through fast charts while others constantly struggle, this is the difference. It's not speed. It's not experience. It's not intelligence. It's the ability to let most things mean nothing without feeling deprived. That ability is rare, and it's what the 5 minute chart quietly selects for. If this chapter is helping you understand why your execution has felt inconsistent despite knowing what to look for, take a moment and like the video. These insights fade quickly if they're not reinforced by attention. And attention is what mastery on this time frame is really built on. Chapter 4. The hardest part of mastering the 5 minute isn't getting into that calm, selective state. It's staying there once the market starts testing it. Because the 5 minute doesn't just move fast, it provokes, it invites reaction. It dares you to prove that you're still in control when things don't unfold neatly. And the moment you think you figured it out, it changes tempo just enough to see if you'll chase it again. You'll feel this most on days when price keeps almost giving you what you want. The structure looks close. The move starts but doesn't quite go. You watch a candle push, then stall. You feel the urge to anticipate, to jump ahead of confirmation because you don't want to be late. This is where most traders slip, not because they forgot their rules, but because they want to stay in rhythm with the chart. They mistake synchronization for mastery. And on the 5 minute, that mistake is costly. Maintaining control here isn't about discipline in the heroic sense. It's about refusal. Refusing to let near misses pull you in. Refusing to let frustration speed you up. Refusing to let the chart set your emotional tempo. That refusal doesn't feel strong. It feels quiet, almost indifferent. And that's why people misjudge it. They think they're disengaging when they're actually protecting the state that allows clarity to exist. There will be days where nothing clean shows up for hours. The 5 minute will move, fake out, reverse, stall, and repeat. Those days are not tests of strategy. They're tests of posture. Can you stay grounded without forcing relevance? Can you let the market be active without you being involved? Can you close the session without feeling like you missed something important? Most traders can't. They need the session to mean something emotionally. And when meaning is required, action follows, even when it shouldn't. You might notice on these days that the urge to interfere shows up physically before it shows up mentally. Restlessness, leaning forward, clicking charts faster, checking other markets, looking for something, anything to justify engagement. These signals matter. They're telling you that your internal pacing is drifting out of alignment. The 5 minute will always detect that drift before you consciously do, and it will exploit it if you let it. This is where mastery becomes maintenance rather than discovery. You're not learning something new, you're preserving something fragile. The calm you developed earlier is easily disrupted by boredom, frustration, or subtle disappointment. Not because you're weak, but because the environment is designed to keep you stimulated. Preserving calm in a stimulating environment is not passive. It's an active choice repeated over and over again. The traders who maintain mastery on the 5 minute learn to notice these internal shifts early. They don't wait until they've already overtraded to course correct. They notice the first hint of urgency and pullback. They don't argue with the feeling. They don't try to suppress it. They simply stop acting until it passes. That pause is everything. It prevents one emotional decision from cascading into a series of technical mistakes. You might think this level of self-awareness is unrealistic in real time. It's not. It's trained through repetition, through sitting with discomfort without resolving it through action, through watching price move without participating, through letting missed opportunities exist without chasing them. Each time you do that, you reinforce the association that inaction is not failure. That association is what keeps you stable when the chart tries to pull you back into old habits. There's also a subtle trap here. Once you've had a few clean sessions, you might feel invincible, calm, controlled, above the noise. That confidence can be just as dangerous as fear. It tempts you to loosen standards, to take a trade because you can handle it now. The 5 minute doesn't care how calm you feel. It only responds to behavior. The moment behavior changes, even slightly, the environment changes too. And suddenly the chart feels noisy again for reasons you can't quite explain. This is why mastery on the 5 minute isn't about building confidence. It's about maintaining humility. Humility to accept that the chart will always be faster than you. That your edge comes from selectivity, not domination. That you're not here to conquer the time frame, but to interact with it on very specific terms. The moment you try to bend it to your will, it pushes back. You'll also notice that emotional residue from outside trading shows up more quickly on the 5 minute than on higher time frames. Stress from your day, frustration from earlier sessions, impatience from life bleeding into the screen. On slower charts, you can sometimes hide from that. On the 5 minute, it's immediately visible in your decisions. That's not a flaw. It's information. It tells you whether you're actually ready to engage or whether you're using the market to discharge emotion. This is where many traders should step away but don't. They trade anyway, telling themselves they can push through it. They mistake endurance for discipline. And the 5 minute punishes that mistake efficiently. Mastery includes knowing when not to trade the 5 minute at all. Not because the market is bad, but because you are. That honesty is rare, and it's one of the reasons this time frame humbles people so consistently. There's a point where you realize that the 5 minute chart doesn't need your constant presence. You don't need to stare at it to control it. You don't need to monitor every fluctuation. You can step back, check in selectively, and still execute cleanly. That realization reduces the mental load dramatically. You're no longer tethered to every candle. You're waiting for something specific to present itself within your framework. And until it does, you're not emotionally invested. This is also where patience stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like alignment. You're not forcing yourself to wait. Waiting feels natural because acting prematurely feels wrong. That inversion is the clearest sign that you're mastering the 5 minute. When restraint becomes intuitive instead of imposed, the time frame stops fighting you. If you've ever felt like you get close to consistency on the 5 minute but can't hold it, this is why. You touched the state, but you didn't yet know how to protect it. Protection doesn't come from stricter rules. It comes from earlier awareness, from noticing when urgency creeps in and choosing not to move with it. That choice looks small, but it's the hinge everything swings on. If this chapter is helping you recognize where things usually start to unravel for you, pause and like the video. Not to lock in motivation, but to mark awareness. Awareness is what allows intervention before damage, and that's the real skill here. Chapter 5. Over time, mastery of the 5 minute stops being something you think about and starts being something you notice in hindsight. You don't wake up one day feeling different. You don't sit down and declare that you figured it out. What happens instead is quieter. You look back over a week, then a month, and realize the chaos that used to define your sessions isn't there anymore. Not because the market changed, but because your reactions did. The 5 minute chart didn't slow down. You stopped speeding yourself up to match it. Your sessions start to feel shorter even when they aren't. Not because you're trading less time, but because you're spending less energy. You're not mentally sprinting from candle to candle. You're not carrying unresolved tension from one decision into the next. There's space between actions now. Breathing room. And that space is what allows the 5 minute to stop feeling hostile and start feeling precise. You notice it in how you approach the screen. You're not eager anymore, not reluctant either, just neutral. You don't sit down hoping for action. You sit down prepared to observe. That shift alone changes everything. Hope creates pressure. Preparation creates patience. And patience on the 5 minute is not passive. It's active restraint. It's choosing to let 95% of what you see pass without response, because you finally understand that responding to everything is what kept you inconsistent for so long. You also stop measuring the quality of a session by how many trades you took. That metric quietly disappears. Some days you trade once, some days not at all, and neither outcome triggers a reaction. You don't feel productive when you trade more. You don't feel lazy when you trade less. Productivity is no longer tied to activity. It's tied to alignment. Did you act when it made sense and stay still when it didn't? That's the only question that matters now. This is where most traders misunderstand what mastery actually looks like. They imagine confidence, decisiveness, speed. What they don't expect is calm, repetition, predictability. Your best 5 minute sessions begin to look boring from the outside. No drama, no flurry of entries, no emotional spikes. And inside, you feel steady, grounded, present. That steadiness is not accidental. It's the byproduct of hundreds of small choices to not react when reaction was available. You'll also notice that losses feel different now. Not smaller emotionally because they're fewer, but because they're cleaner. When a loss happens, it doesn't linger. It doesn't infect the rest of the session. You don't carry it into the next setup. You don't feel the urge to fix it. The loss is absorbed and forgotten because it never became personal in the first place. That emotional containment is one of the clearest signs that you're no longer fighting the time frame. Wins change too. They stop being relief. They stop being proof. They stop being fuel. They're just outcomes. You acknowledge them, log them, and move on. There's no urge to capitalize on momentum by forcing the next trade. You trust that whatever produced the win will show up again when it's ready. That trust doesn't come from optimism. It comes from experience. From seeing that forcing continuation is how streaks die on the 5 minute. What's interesting is how this mastery starts to bleed into other areas of your trading without effort. Higher timeframes feel slower, calmer, easier to read. Not because they changed, but because your tolerance for inactivity has increased. You're no longer uncomfortable waiting. You're no longer interpreting silence as failure. That shift makes everything else feel simpler. The 5 minute didn't just train you to trade fast. It trained you to be selective under pressure. You might notice that you care less about being right. Not because accuracy doesn't matter, but because being right doesn't carry emotional reward anymore. Execution does. Clean entries, clean exits, clean inaction. That's where satisfaction lives now. It's subtle, but it's durable. It doesn't evaporate after a loss. It doesn't inflate after a win. It just sits there, steady, reinforcing behavior that works over time. This is also when you stop trying to optimize the 5 minute endlessly. You're not constantly tweaking. You're not searching for confirmation that you've found the best way. You settle into something that fits how you operate, and you let it breathe. That restraint is rare. Most traders never stop adjusting long enough to let anything stabilize. Mastery requires you to stop touching things that aren't broken just because you feel restless. Like, there's a moment where you realize that the 5 minute no longer intimidates you. Not because you've conquered it, but because you understand it. You know what it demands from you. You know when you're not in the right state to engage. You know when to step away. That self-awareness is far more valuable than any technical insight. It keeps you from doing damage on days when your internal pacing is off, which used to be the days that hurt you the most. You'll also notice that your relationship with time changes. You're no longer racing the session. You're no longer thinking in terms of squeezing value out of every minute. Time becomes something you occupy, not something you fight. That shift removes a surprising amount of stress. You stop feeling like you're wasting potential when nothing is happening. You understand that nothing happening is often the point. This is where the 5 minute stops feeling like a test and starts feeling like a tool. A precise one. One that only works when handled carefully. You're no longer trying to dominate it. You're cooperating with it. And cooperation doesn't feel weak here. It feels efficient. You're no longer competing with the speed of the chart. You're letting it move while you remain steady. That contrast is what creates edge. If you think back to when you first started trading the 5 minute, the difference is stark. You were reactive, eager, tense. You felt like the chart was always one step ahead of you. Now you're comfortable being behind. You're not trying to predict. You're waiting to respond. That single shift changes everything about how the time frame behaves for you. The market didn't slow down. You stopped chasing it. This is also where confidence finally becomes real. Not loud, not performative. Quiet, internal. You don't need to prove anything to the chart. You don't need to force a good session. You trust yourself to behave correctly regardless of what the market offers. That trust is earned. It comes from watching yourself choose restraint over impulse repeatedly. And once you have it, you don't want to give it up by slipping back into old habits. There's a subtle freedom that comes with this mastery. You're no longer tethered to the screen emotionally. You can walk away without fear of missing something important. You can end a session early if conditions aren't right without feeling regret. That freedom doesn't come from detachment from results. It comes from detachment from urgency. And urgency was always the thing that kept you trapped. You might also notice that other traders' behavior starts to stand out more clearly. You see the overtrading, the chasing, the emotional reactions. Not with judgment, but with recognition. You remember what that felt like. And you understand why so many people struggle here. The 5 minute is unforgiving. Not because it's fast, but because it reflects behavior instantly. It doesn't give you time to rationalize mistakes. It shows them to you in real time. This is why mastery of the 5 minute tends to change how people think about trading altogether. Once you've learned to stay calm, selective, and grounded in an environment designed to provoke reaction, slower environments feel manageable by comparison. You've trained your nervous system, not just your strategy. And that training carries over into everything else you do in the market. If you're listening to this and imagining what your trading would look like without constant mental noise, without the feeling of being pulled into every movement, pause and like the video. Not as approval, but as a marker. This is the kind of shift that only happens if you stay aware of it long enough for behavior to follow. Liking it is a way of saying you're paying attention, not just consuming information. Mastering the 5 minute doesn't make you aggressive. It makes you precise. It doesn't make you faster, it makes you calmer. And calm is what allows speed to exist without chaos. The traders who fail here aren't slow learners, they're impatient ones. They want results before they're ready to hold the state required to produce them consistently. If you've made it this far, understand this. The 5 minute time frame doesn't owe you anything. It doesn't reward effort, intelligence, or desire. It rewards alignment. When your internal pace matches the demands of the chart, execution becomes simple. When it doesn't, nothing works no matter how skilled you are. Mastery is not forcing that alignment. It's maintaining it. Subscribe if this way of thinking resonates. Not because you need more strategies, but because mastering trading is mostly about mastering yourself under pressure. This channel exists to talk about that part honestly, without shortcuts or theatrics. The 5-minute chart will always be fast. The question is whether you're willing to slow yourself down enough to actually use it properly. When you do, the time frame stops being something you fight and starts being something you respect. And respect, more than anything else, is what turns the 5-minute from a source of frustration into a tool you can rely on day after day.